Vanguard has recently made 30 of its accumulation funds available on their UK platform. So here are 5 of the best Vanguard funds that I think everyone should own in 2024 and beyond. In fact, for those who stay until the end, I will show you how these funds can turn you into a millionaire. Okay, some people may not agree with this first fund, but I strongly believe that the Vanguard FTSE Emerging Markets ETF should be part of every investor's portfolio, and I will explain why shortly. From a high level, we can see that it invests in over 2,100 large and mid-sized stocks for an ongoing charge of 0.22% per year. This fund was created 11 years ago and it's got $2.2 billion pulled into it, so it's quite popular among investors. Looking deeper into its portfolio data, China, India and Taiwan make up almost 70% of the fund, which means that its returns will be largely dependent on how companies in these 3 countries perform. And in terms of its top 10 stocks, they include names such as Taiwan Semiconductors, Tencent, Alibaba and so on. With regards to its past performance, the fund hasn't actually done too well in the past 10 years, returning only about 2% per year on average. But when things do go well, it can return as much as 30% in a single year, as you can see from this data here. Nevertheless, despite their poor past performance, there are good reasons why I personally invest in emerging markets, as you'll see shortly. The last thing I want to mention is that this fund also pays a nice dividend of 2.76% at the time of this video. And there are 2 versions you can choose from: the accumulation class and the distribution class. Until recently, the accumulation version of this fund wasn't available on the UK platform, but they've now added them here, which is a big plus, as many people were investing in this version through other investment platforms. Now, there are many reasons why I think emerging markets deserve a place in our investment portfolios. First of all, it's a known fact that over the long term, companies in emerging markets have tended to grow faster than those in developed markets, and the total value of the emerging stock markets is projected to continue rising at a faster pace than developed countries. In fact, Goldman Sachs forecasts the emerging markets share of the global stock market to rise from around 27% currently to 35% in 2030 and 47% in 2050. India in particular is expected to have the largest increase in global market cap share, from a little under 3% in 2022 to 8% in 2050, and China's share will rise from 10% to 15% by 2050. Therefore, it makes sense for us to be positioned to take advantage of that growth. But that's not all. The interesting thing is that even though they currently represent around 27% of the total global market cap, they contribute to a whopping 45% of global GDP. So they are massively underrepresented in terms of market cap versus their contribution to the global economy. But this means that as their incomes increase over time, the share of global GDP accounted for by EMs will continue to rise too. Over the course of the projections, Goldman Sachs Research expects emerging markets' share of global GDP to rise to 50% by 2030 and to 60% by 2050. And in 2050, the world's 5 largest economies will be China, the US, India, Indonesia, and Germany. So this presents great opportunities for us as investors, which is why, in my opinion, it's a smart move to allocate a small portion of our portfolios, say 5 to 10%, to this part of the world. However, it's worth noting that emerging markets are definitely one of the riskiest investments out there, because they include stocks from countries which are associated with political risks, corruption, currency risk, and so on. Nevertheless, if you decide that emerging markets don't deserve a place in your portfolio, the next fund that you may want to consider is a developed world fund, such as the Vanguard FTSE Developed World ETF. As the name suggests, this fund only targets those companies in developed markets, leaving out the riskier emerging markets. From a high level, we can see that it has over 2,100 large and mid-sized company stocks inside of it, and it charges only 0.12% per year. So it's diversified and cheap. It's also popular with investors, as it has over $2.2 billion invested in it. If we dig a little deeper and look at the geographical diversification, we can see that the US is going to dominate, with 67% allocated there. But you will also have more than 30% of your investment outside of it, in Japan, UK, and some other countries from Europe and the Pacific regions. And unsurprisingly, the top 10 stocks include the US giants: Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, etc. Outside of the top 10, you will find European names like Nestle and Korean companies like Samsung. This developed world ETF also pays a dividend of 1.73% at the time of this video, which is distributed quarterly. And as I mentioned earlier, you now have the option to reinvest these dividends automatically automatically into the fund via the accumulation class. Therefore, this ETF may be ideal for you if you want to spread your money across the major markets in the world and exclude the riskier emerging markets. All in all, you would get exposure to about 80 to 90% of the global investable universe. Now, given that almost 70% of this fund will be invested in the US market, you may decide to just go all in on America. And you could do so by investing either in the US Equity Index Fund or the S&P 500 ETF. Why do I think that any of these is an ideal fund to own in 2024 and beyond? Well, simply because the US market is the biggest stock market in the world. And regardless of whether you invest only in the largest 500 US companies through an S&P 500 ETF or in the broader market through the US Equity Index Fund, your portfolio is in a good position to grow. The main difference between these two funds is in terms of risk and diversification. The US Equity Index Fund has the S&P 500 inside of it, representing about 80% of the fund, but the remaining 20% is accounted for by many other small and mid-sized companies, for a total of almost 4,000 stocks. So it's more diversified, which can minimize risk as well as increase the chances of higher returns, because those smaller companies have the potential to grow fast. And when that happens, your portfolio will also grow. For example, if we put them side by side, we can see that the US Equity Index Fund has beaten the S&P 500 by about 2% in the past 10 years, returning 13.6% per year on average versus 11.4%. So you can see that there is a slight difference in returns due to the presence of smaller stocks. In terms of fees, the difference is minimal. The S&P 500 ETF costs only 0.7%, while the US Equity Index Fund has an annual fee of 0.10%. The top 10 holdings of each fund are exactly the same. They both include the big stocks like Microsoft, which now takes the top spot, Apple, Amazon, Nvidia, and so on. So it's clear that the technology sector dominates. The main difference is in the percentage allocated to each, which is all based on their market cap. This means that the bigger the company, the bigger the share of the fund. Lastly, both of these funds also pay a small dividend of 1.25% at the time of this video. And again, you now have the option to reinvest the dividends automatically with both of these funds. Therefore, as you can see, these funds are very similar. And in my opinion, either of them is a great investment to buy and hold forever, because they're both cheap and have offered amazing returns over the years. Nevertheless, your choice will depend on whether you want exposure to the entire US stock market or to only the largest 500 US stocks. It's worth noting that if you decide to go for the total US market fund, your portfolio might be slightly riskier, because smaller stocks don't have the resources to survive through tough market conditions and can decline in price sharply. One thing you should avoid is investing in both of these funds, because you will end up owning many of the same companies twice and you will pay additional fees for nothing. So keep that in mind. But rather than deciding whether we should target only the US market, the developed world, or the emerging markets, a good alternative is to keep it simple and invest in all of them through a global index fund. But before we look at my favorite global fund, do me a huge favor and hit that subscribe button. Help me get this number below 50%. Thank you. The next fund on my list is the Vanguard FTSE Global All Cap Index Fund. From a high level, you can see that this fund tracks over 7,100 small, mid, and large cap stocks from all over the world for a very low fee of 0.23%. The top 10 holdings include mainly American companies, which is because, as you can see from this breakdown, the fund allocates 61% of your money to the US market, followed by Japan, UK, and so on. When it comes to its past performance, as a result of the heavy allocation to the American stocks, as well as diversification across other countries, you can see that the index has returned 10.5% per year on average in the past 10 years. And lastly, this fund also pays a dividend of 1.75% per year. Now, as I mentioned earlier, apart from investing in large companies, it also includes small cap stocks from all over the world. So as with the US Equity Index Fund, this means two things: potentially higher returns, but also extra risk. Therefore, if you want to reduce some of that risk but still invest in the entire world, the next best option is the FTSE All World ETF. This is another global fund, but this one invests only in medium and large cap stocks. As you can see, it tracks fewer companies, only 3,700, as opposed to over 7,000 in the all cap fund. But it's slightly cheaper, at 0.22% per year. So it's still greatly diversified, but the lack of small companies will reduce the risk and the potential for extra growth. And this is something that many people actually prefer. Rather than gambling on the success of those smaller stocks, they're happy with playing it a bit safer and sticking only to the larger larger companies. In other words, they're happy to sacrifice some growth if it means minimizing some of the risk. Looking at its past performance, it's returned 7.6% per year on average in the past 10 years. 3% lower than the global all cap, but still a good return. And lastly, the fund also pays a small dividend of 1.74% per year. Overall, both of these two global funds are a great choice if you just want to invest in a single fund that covers all bases without having to work out which individual market to invest in and how much. You essentially own the entire world, which means that you don't have to worry about which country performs best, as you have exposure to all of them. The last fund on my list is another global fund, but this is one that pays a high dividend. That is the FTSE All World High Dividend Yield ETF. For those of you who are still around, do me a huge favor and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you. This fund is specifically put together to generate high quality payments from some of the world's largest companies. One of the reasons why I think it's an excellent fund to own if you want to earn a dividend income is that we've seen years after years that high quality blue chip businesses tend to hold their ground during difficult times, and all of the hyped stocks which promise a lot of growth but fail to do so can let you down. The fund has over 1,800 high dividend paying stocks from all over the world inside of it, but it does come at a cost of 0.29% per year. But despite the higher cost, it's very popular with investors, with almost $4 billion invested in it. Taking a look at its top holdings, we can see that it includes big cash producing businesses that have been around for a very long time and paid consistent dividends going back many years. Names like Exxon, J&J, P&G, and so on. Many of these are based in the United States because the US accounts for over 40% of the fund. But you'll also find European stocks such as Nestle, Shell, or AstraZeneca, and even Japanese names like Toyota. At the time of the video, the annual dividend yield is 3.48%, meaning that a £10,000 investment would generate about £348 per year, and you'll be paid quarterly. It's worth noting that this figure fluctuates depending on how these companies are doing, as dividends are never guaranteed, so this is something to consider. You also want the value of your portfolio to grow over time, and with that said, this fund has actually performed quite well in the past decade, returning 4.8% per year on average, while still paying out dividends, which is pretty good for a dividend fund. So if dividends are something that you care about, this fund could be for you. In terms of how these funds can make you a millionaire, well, if we assume that they will return an average of 10% per year in the next 30 years, a £500 monthly investment in any of these funds over that period should see you with almost £1 million. Although it's worth noting that some of them will be more volatile than others, so keeping a diversified portfolio and remaining invested in the long run is key to reaching that £1 million target. And of course, the more you invest each month, the quicker you'll get there. But regardless of which fund or combination of funds you choose to invest in, it's important to keep your eye open for new strategies that can complement your core portfolio and lead to higher returns in the long term. So watch this video next to learn about a popular style of investing that's expected to benefit long-term performance.